January 14th, 1954. San Francisco City Hall. 3 minutes in a municipal judge's chambers, a brown suit instead of a white dress. And roughly 500 people jammed into the corridor outside because the bride had telephoned the newspapers herself. 9 months later, a court in Santa Monica dissolved that marriage on the grounds of cruelty, not incompatibility, not irreconcilable differences. Cruelty. That is the legal finding, entered October 27, 1954, and it is the single most edited-out fact in one of the most retold love stories in American history. Because the story you know isn't the courtroom. The story you know is the flowers. 3 deliveries a week to a crypt in Westwood for 20 years, from a man who never remarried and never said her name in public again. America decided that standing order with a florist was the truth of the marriage. It wasn't. He had married an actress once before, and she had quit acting, and he had counted that as a success. The whole thing began with a publicity photograph that he asked a stranger to get for him. She married him 10 days after her own studio suspended her without pay, and he was on her side of that fight. 9 months in a hotel suite on the east side of Manhattan, something happened that 3 separate members of a film crew described the following morning. And he was offered fortunes, real money, repeatedly, for 45 years, to tell his side of it. He refused every single offer until the day he died. That refusal is the reason you believe the version you believe. It started with a photograph. Spring, 1951. The Chicago White Sox were in Pasadena for spring training, and a studio publicity man arranged the oldest gag in the business. Put the new blonde on the field with the ball players, hand her a bat, let the wire services do the rest. She posed with a couple of players. One of them was an outfielder named Gus Zernial. The picture ran in papers all over the country, exactly as designed. Joe DiMaggio saw it, and according to Zernial's own account, repeated for decades afterward, DiMaggio's question wasn't about the swing. It was how a journeyman outfielder had ended up standing next to that woman. He wanted the introduction. Hold that in your hand, because it's the whole marriage in miniature, and it happens before they have met. He did not see her in a film. He did not see her across a room. He saw a manufactured image produced by a publicity department for mass circulation, and he wanted the original. He would spend the next 3 years trying to take the original out of circulation. The introduction took about a year to arrange. A publicist named David March finally set up a blind date in March 1952 at a restaurant on the Sunset Strip. She didn't want to go. By her own telling afterward, she expected a loud man in a purple suit because that was her idea of an athlete, and what she got was a man in a gray suit with a blue polka dot tie who barely spoke. There's a widely repeated detail that Mickey Rooney came over and started talking baseball, and that only then did she understand what she was sitting across from. That one reaches us through anecdote rather than document, so file it accordingly. But the shape is corroborated by everyone present. She did not know who he was. She had to be told. For him, that was the entire appeal. He had spent 13 years being recognized. In December 1951, 3 months before that dinner, he had retired. He was 37, his knees and his heel were finished. His batting average in his final season was the worst of his career, and he had walked away rather than be seen declining. He was, on the night of that blind date, a man whose crowd had just stopped. She was 25, going on 26, and hers was about to start. That asymmetry is not a mood. It's the mechanism. Everything cruel in this marriage runs off it. Now go back further, because you cannot understand what he asked of her without understanding the house he came out of. Giuseppe DiMaggio came from Isola delle Femmine, off the coast of Sicily, and settled in Martinez, California, and then in the Italian quarter of San Francisco, and he fished. 9 children. Joe was the eighth. The family spoke Sicilian at home. Joe hated the boat, hated the smell of it, quit school at Galileo High, and sold newspapers instead. And by 21, he was in a Yankee uniform being written about in a language his parents did not comfortably read. Then came 1942. Under wartime restrictions, Giuseppe and Rosalie DiMaggio, parents of the most famous athlete in America, were classified as enemy aliens. Giuseppe was barred from the fishing waters he had worked for 4 decades. Accounts differ on the precise handling of the boat and the permits, and I'd rather flag that than tidy it, but the category is not in dispute. While their son's face was on magazine covers, his mother and father needed permission to move around their own bay. Remember the boat. We're going to need it in about 20 minutes at a subway grate on Lexington Avenue. Because here is the lesson a family learns from that year. Visibility is not a reward. Visibility is exposure. Being looked at by strangers is what happens to you immediately before something is taken away. So you keep the family inside the house, you keep your business in the family, and you never, under any circumstances, explain yourself to the press. Now meet the other one. Norma Jean Mortenson, born in Los Angeles County Hospital on June 1st, 1926. No father on the certificate that meant anything. A mother, Gladys, committed with a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia when the girl was 8, and institutionalized for most of the rest of her life. Foster placements. A stretch in an orphanage on El Centro Avenue from 1935. Then at 16, in June 1942, the same year the DiMaggios were being told where they could not sail, she married a 21-year-old neighbor's son named James Dougherty, largely because the alternative was another foster home. Look at what that first marriage was, not a romance, an exit. And when she started modeling while he was in the Merchant Marine, he wanted her to stop. She didn't. They divorced in 1946. She signed with 20th Century Fox, and an executive gave her a new name. So by the time she meets Joe DiMaggio, she has already been married once to a man who wanted her to stop being looked at. She is about to marry a second one. What did each of them see across that restaurant table? Both columns, honestly, because the version where she was simply a starstruck girl and he was simply a jealous brute flattens two intelligent people into cartoons. He saw a woman unimpressed by the only thing he had ever been. That's not nothing. Every room he had entered for over a decade had rearranged itself around him, and here was somebody who had to have him explained. He also saw, and this is where it gets colder, a project. She was in trouble in ways he understood as fixable. Wardrobe he considered indecent. Photographers he considered parasites. A studio he considered a pimp with an accounting department. He had opinions about all of it within weeks. She saw a father. That reading is so obvious that biographers have been making it since the 50s, and it's probably true as far as it goes. But there was a colder column on her side too, and it deserves saying out loud. In March 1952, days after that blind date, the story broke that the calendar nude circulating in truck stops and barbershops was her. She had posed for the photographer Tom Kelly in May 1949 on a red velvet drape, and she had been paid $50. $50. Set that figure down. We are coming back to it at the very end. The studio's instinct was to bury it. Her instinct, the first genuinely brilliant thing she ever did in public, was to confirm it, explain that she'd needed the rent, and let the country decide. The country decided in her favor. But in the spring of 1952, with that story in every paper in America, what was the single most respectable thing a young actress could possibly be photographed doing? Having dinner with Joe DiMaggio. I'm not claiming she calculated it. There's no document that proves intent, and I won't invent one. I'm pointing at the arithmetic. The most damaging publicity of her career and the most legitimizing relationship of her life arrive in the same fortnight. And for the next 2 years, every time a photographer wanted to print the calendar girl, there was a Yankee in the frame. He was, among other things, extremely useful. Both things ran at once. That's the pattern for everything that follows. And now the plant that matters most, the one that tells you this was never going to end any other way. Joe DiMaggio had been married before. In November 1939, he married a movie actress named Dorothy Arnold. She had a contract, she had credits, and after they married and after their son, Joe Jr., was born in October 1941, she stopped. That career ended. The marriage ended too, in 1944, and she said afterward, in words reported at the time, that being married to him meant being alone. But note the sequence, because he did. He had run this experiment once already. From his side, the part where the actress quits had worked perfectly. They dated for nearly 2 years, and it was rockier than the newsreels suggest. There were public splits. In September 1952, she appeared at the Miss America parade in Atlantic City. In a low-cut dress, the pictures went everywhere, and he was by every account furious. Not embarrassed for her, furious at her. In 1953, while he was semi-retired and doing television work, she made Niagara, then Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, then How to Marry a Millionaire. 3 films. In 1 year, she went from starlet to the biggest thing in the industry. Watch the direction of travel. His fame is a fixed asset, already earned, appreciating quietly. Hers is compounding daily, visibly, and in a currency he had learned to distrust in 1942. Now here is the arithmetic underneath all that fame, and it's the part the love story never touches, because it explains the wedding. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes was her picture, her title role, her song, the number every human being on earth can still hum. Her co-star Jane Russell was on loan from Howard Hughes and, by the figures that circulate, was paid somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 for it. Monroe was a contract employee on a weekly wage. Her own account of it, given years later, was blunt. Russell got the $200,000, and she got her $500 a week. Now, the sources disagree on those numbers, and I'm going to say so rather than pick the most dramatic one. Some accounts put her total for the picture at $18,000. Some put her contract at $1,500 a month. Some say Russell's figure was $100,000, not $2. The precise arithmetic is genuinely unresolved and probably always will be, because studio contract terms from 1953 were nobody's business by design. But notice that the disagreement is only ever about the size of the gap. Nobody disputes the direction. Every version has the woman on the poster earning a fraction of the woman beside her, and then the figure that isn't in dispute at all. On January 4, 1954, 20th Century Fox suspended Marilyn Monroe without pay for refusing to report for a picture called The Girl in Pink Tights. She thought the script was garbage. Fox wouldn't even let her read it before assigning it to her. And she had learned that her intended co-star, Frank Sinatra, was contracted at $5,000 a week against her $1,500. $1,500 against $5,000. That's the number that ended a marriage before it started, and it's an odd thing to say, so let me show you why. 10 days after that suspension, she married him. Read those 2 dates together because almost nobody does. Why did Marilyn Monroe marry Joe DiMaggio in the second week of January 1954, at 3 days' notice, in a brown suit, in a judge's chambers? Look at what he was offering. She was unemployed by her own choice, in open warfare with the corporation that owned her contract, being paid 1/3 of what the man beside her name would earn, and she had just been told she couldn't see the script. And here was the most respected man in America saying she was right, that Hollywood was a racket, that they were all thieves, and that she should walk away from the whole filthy business. Every word of that was support. Every word of it was also, functionally, an offer to make her stop. He wasn't lying to her, and he wasn't manipulating her. He simply believed sincerely that the solution to being underpaid and disrespected by an industry was to leave the industry, and by an accident of timing, the only person in her life who agreed that she was being cheated was also the one person who wanted her career to end. That's not a rescue. That's an alignment of interests that only holds while she's losing. The wedding is a document, so read it as one instead of as a scene. San Francisco City Hall, Judge Charles Peary's chambers, January 14, 1954. 3 minutes. His friend Reno Barsocchini as witness. A dark brown suit with a fur collar. No church, because he was a Catholic who had already been divorced, and the church was not available to him, a detail that mattered enormously to his family and appears nowhere in the myth. And in the corridor outside, hundreds of reporters, photographers, and gawkers filling the hallway because she had called the studio press office and told them. He was reportedly angry about that. Of course he was. She had done the only thing she knew how to do, which was to let it be seen, and he had married her partly in order to stop that from happening. The honeymoon confirms the reading. They drove south and spent the first night in a motel in Paso Robles. And the detail that has survived 60 years is that he specifically requested a room with a television. Then 2 weeks at a friend's cabin near Palm Springs, hidden. Then he took her to Japan, not as a holiday. He'd been invited by his old manager, Lefty O'Doul, on a baseball goodwill tour, and the wedding trip was folded into his work. The honeymoon was a business trip in his industry. And in Japan, the theoretical became concrete, because the crowds at the Tokyo airport were not there for the ball player. They tore at her. The Japanese press wanted her. There's a line attached to that trip for decades, a reporter or an official asking, in effect, who the man with Marilyn Monroe was. Whether anyone said it in those words, I can't verify, and it doesn't matter. The photographs verify it. Look at the airport footage and count which way the lenses point. It's also on this trip that the ugliest material in this story first appears. Several biographers, working from interviews conducted decades later, report that she was bruised in Japan and showed those bruises to at least one person. Those accounts are late, secondhand, and come from writers with a thesis. Label them what they are: allegations unadjudicated from interested sources. I'm not going to build a case on them. I don't have to. The court did that in October, and we'll get there. What is not disputed is what happened when she left that trip. In mid-February 1954, 4 days in, she flew from Japan to Korea to perform for American troops. 10 shows in 4 days, on open-air stages, in a cocktail dress. In February, for tens of thousands of soldiers at a time. She had a fever. She did it anyway. She said for the rest of her life that it was the best thing that ever happened to her. And every person around her in those years agreed that she meant it. And there's an exchange from her return that has been quoted so often, it's worn smooth and it's worth slowing right down on. She told him he'd never heard cheering like that. He said, yes, I have. 2 words, maybe 3. And if you want to know what was structurally wrong with this marriage, you don't need the bruises and you don't need the biographers. You need those 3 words, because that is not a boast. That's a correction. She had come back from the single most affirming experience of her life and offered it to him, and he received it as a claim against his record and moved to settle it. That's not insecurity. That's an audit. They were competing for the same finite resource, not money. Money was never the issue. They both had money, a crowd. He had spent his and was pretending he hadn't. Hers was arriving in waves, and she was drowning in it happily. There was no available version of this marriage in which they both got fed. They came home in late February. They lived partly in San Francisco, in a house on Beach Street with his sister Marie. Worth pausing on, because it means the biggest star in the world spent part of her 9-month marriage living in her husband's family home under his sister's housekeeping. And they lived at 508 North Palm Drive in Beverly Hills. And by every account from the people who were in and out of those houses, this is where the actual cruelty lived, and it isn't what you're expecting. He didn't rage constantly. He went silent. This is the part her own sworn testimony would eventually be about. And it's the part that always gets cut, because silence doesn't photograph. He would not speak to her for days at a stretch. He watched television. He didn't want her friends in the house. He didn't want her working. When she asked what was wrong, according to what she testified under oath, she got indifference, or she was told to shut up. And here is where the family method comes into focus, and where I want to be precise rather than lurid, because the standard telling makes him a hothead, and that is far too flattering. A hothead is a man who loses control. What the record describes is a man exercising it. The silence was not a temper failure, it was an instrument. The same one his family had used for a generation. You do not explain, you do not discuss, you do not let it out of the house. Applied to a business rival, that's discipline. Applied to a woman who had been abandoned by every adult in her childhood, it is the most precisely targeted weapon available on earth. That's not jealousy, that's a system. And in the middle of it, she was working. She shot There's No Business Like Show Business in the spring and hated it. She was still fighting Fox. She'd begun singing lessons with a vocal coach named Hal Schaefer, and by mid-1954, that had become something more than lessons. In July 1954, Schaefer was hospitalized after a suicide attempt. That's documented, and it tells you the temperature of that summer. If you're getting something out of this one, subscribe. The last third of this story is where it stops being a Hollywood marriage and becomes a surveillance operation. Then September 1954, and the moment I'd argue is the actual center of this marriage. Not the most violent thing that happened, but the one event that shows you the entire architecture in a single night. The 7-year itch was shooting exteriors in New York. On the night of September 15, 1954, on Lexington Avenue at 52nd Street, Billy Wilder set up the shot every human being alive can now describe. White halter dress, subway grating, wind machine under the street. It was 1 a.m, and because word had gone out, there were somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people packed onto the sidewalks, overwhelmingly men on ladders, on car roofs, whistling and shouting through take after take after take, 15 takes by some accounts. The footage was largely unusable and had to be reshot on a closed lot in Los Angeles. Joe DiMaggio was brought to that street corner to watch. Accounts differ on whether Wilder invited him or the columnist Walter Winchell walked him over, and it hardly matters which, though the possibility that it was a gossip columnist is almost too perfect. Now bring the boat back. This is a man from a family formerly forbidden to work the water because of who they were, whose parents needed papers to move around their own city while his face sold magazines. A man who had built an entire personality on the principle that being looked at by strangers is the thing that precedes loss. And he is standing on a New York sidewalk at 1 a.m, watching 2,000 men bay at his wife's underwear, while a director calls for another take. He left. According to accounts from people staying at the same hotel, there was a violent argument in their suite at the St. Regis that night. And the next morning on set, members of the crew, including her hairdresser and her longtime makeup man, both of whom spoke about it later, described bruises on her shoulders and back. Here's my sourcing position, and I'm not going to improve it. Those are contemporaneous eyewitnesses to the aftermath, not to the act, giving accounts later. There was no charge and no adjudication. What is not in dispute is that within roughly 2 weeks of that night, the marriage was publicly over, and that when her lawyers put a cause in front of a judge, the cause they chose was cruelty, and he did not contest it. October 4th, 1954. Outside the house on North Palm Drive, in front of a crowd of reporters, Marilyn Monroe came out with the attorney Jerry Giesler and could not speak. She got a few words out and broke. Giesler handled the rest. It is one of the most photographed moments of her life, and she is not performing in it. DiMaggio, meanwhile, had loaded his car and driven north to San Francisco. He did not comment. He would not comment for 45 years. On October 27, 1954, she testified. She described a husband who went days without speaking to her, who was cold and indifferent, who objected to her having visitors, who told her to shut up when she tried to reach him. It took a matter of minutes. The interlocutory decree was granted on grounds of mental cruelty. Set that transcript down. It is the only sworn, contemporaneous first-person account of the inside of this marriage that exists anywhere on Earth, and we're coming back to what happened to it. Now, most tellings end the cruelty there, with the decree and pivot to the roses, which is how the single most disturbing chapter gets skipped entirely, because he didn't accept it. On the night of November 5th, 1954, 9 days after the decree, Joe DiMaggio was in a car outside an apartment building on Waring Avenue in Los Angeles. With him was Frank Sinatra, who, by his own later testimony, stayed in the car, and a private investigator named Barney Ruditsky, and an operative named Philip Irwin. They believed Monroe was inside with Hal Schaefer. Men went up. A door was kicked in. It was the wrong door. The apartment belonged to a woman named Florence Kotz, who was asleep, and who woke to men breaking into her home. She screamed. They ran. She sued. The matter settled for a reported few $1,000s, and it would have stayed a strange footnote except that in 1957, a California State Senate committee investigating private detective abuses hauled the participants in and put it on the record. Sinatra testified. It has been known as the wrong door raid ever since, and it is almost always told as a farce. Strip the celebrity out and describe it plainly. 9 days after a court found that a man had treated his wife cruelly, that man retained professional investigators, had her followed, and stood outside a building at night while operatives forced a door on a sleeping woman. There are also long-standing reports from the same period and repeated by his most thorough biographer that Monroe's phone was tapped. I'd label the wiretap as reported rather than proven. The break-in doesn't need labeling. It's in the legislative record. That's not a jealous husband. That's an operation with a budget and subcontractors. And that is the cruelty this story is actually about, not a slap. A man who could not permit an account of himself to exist outside his control, and who kept trying to get back inside the room after the door had been legally shut. Now here is where the story turns, because what she did next is the part buried under all of it. In January 1955, 4 months after that press conference, Marilyn Monroe announced the formation of Marilyn Monroe Productions with the photographer Milton Green. She had walked out on 20th Century Fox. She moved to New York. She studied with Lee Strasberg. She refused to work and let the suspension run. And at the end of 1955, Fox came back and gave her a new contract with approval over her directors and material and a substantially higher salary, terms almost unheard of for an actress inside that system. Look at what the marriage was supposed to accomplish and what it actually produced. He married her partly to get her to stop. 9 months in his house, and she came out the other side and incorporated herself. The woman who walked into that judge's chambers in January 1954 was a suspended salaried employee, earning $1,500 a week against her co-star's $5,000, with a nude calendar behind her and a husband who wanted her indoors. The woman who walked out held script approval and a company with her own name on the letterhead. That's not a recovery. That's a promotion she issued to herself. And then, years later, the thing that makes this genuinely hard, and which I won't soften because softening it would be dishonest to both of them. In February 1961, Marilyn Monroe was admitted to the Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic in New York on her psychiatrist's referral. She was put behind a locked door on a ward for severely ill patients. She was, by her own written account, terrified, and she wrote from inside asking for help. The person who came was Joe DiMaggio. He was in Florida. She reached him, he flew up, he went to that hospital, and he made it clear that if she was not released, he would take the building apart. She was transferred to Columbia Presbyterian within a day. He then took her to Florida in March, to where he was working with the Yankees at spring training, and stayed with her while she recovered. He had nothing to gain. No press conference, no arranged photograph, no book. He had been divorced from her for 6 years, and would be for the rest of her life, and by every account, it is the least self-interested act performed by any adult in Marilyn Monroe's entire life. Both things are true. The man who hired the detectives in 1954 is the man who got her off that ward in 1961. The marriage was cruel, and he loved her, and neither cancels the other. Anyone telling you this story with only one of those halves in it is selling you something. There are reports, principally from his biographer Richard Ben Kramer and from people in his circle, that by 1962 he had left his job to be available to her and intended to ask her to remarry him, with some accounts naming a date in early August. Treat that as reported and unresolved, because the people who told it had reasons, and the one person who could confirm it was dead within days. August 4th, 1962. Among the last phone conversations of her life was one with a young man in Marine Corps service named Joe DiMaggio Jr., his son from the first marriage, the boy whose mother had quit acting in 1944. She had stayed close to him for 8 years after divorcing his father. He called her that evening to say he'd broken off an engagement. Friends said afterward that she sounded pleased. She was found dead early on August 5th, 1962. She was 36. Now watch what Joe DiMaggio did, because this is the twist, and it has been sitting in plain sight for 60 years disguised as a bouquet. He claimed the body. He was not her husband, not her executor, and had no legal standing anyone could name. And he arranged the funeral at Westwood Village Mortuary on August 8th, and he decided who was permitted to enter. He kept out Hollywood. Around 30 people were admitted. Frank Sinatra, not invited. The Rat Pack, not invited. Peter Lawford, and through him, the Kennedys, whom he blamed, not invited. The studio executives, the columnists, the photographers who had made her and fed on her, locked out, standing in the street behind barricades with the crowd. For one afternoon, Joe DiMaggio got the exact thing he had wanted since he asked a stranger for that publicity photograph in 1951. He got her indoors, in a small room, with the crowd outside and the doors shut, and he chose who was allowed to look at her. That's not a private funeral. That's the guest list he never got at his own wedding. Then he arranged for roses to be delivered to the crypt, reportedly 3 times a week, reportedly for 20 years. And then he said nothing for the rest of his life. Understand the scale of what he turned down. He lived another 37 years, until March 8th, 1999. He was one of the most sought-after interview subjects in America, and in his later decades he made serious money signing his name at memorabilia shows. Publishers came with offers, networks came with offers. Every one of them wanted the same chapter. He refused all of them, and by multiple accounts he would not sign photographs of her and would leave a room where she was raised. He never remarried. 66, 75, 80, same answer. Nothing. You can read that as the purest devotion in the history of American celebrity. Millions of people have, and I understand why. But look at what it accomplished. There are 2 accounts of this marriage in existence. One is a sworn deposition given by a 28-year-old woman in a Santa Monica courtroom on October 27, 1954, describing days of silence and being told to shut up, on the strength of which a judge made a legal finding of cruelty. The other is a standing order with a florist. Which one do you know? Which one is on the mugs and the posters and in the documentaries? Which one gets called the truest thing in either of their lives? He did not keep an archive. He did something far more effective. He kept a vacuum, and he kept it for 45 years, and a vacuum in a story this famous does not stay empty. The public fills it. And what the public poured into the silence of a dignified, grieving, flower-sending old man was a love story so powerful that it swallowed a court record whole. There is no DiMaggio version of this marriage, and that is precisely why the DiMaggio version won. You cannot argue with a man who never made a claim. You cannot fact-check Flowers. Everything documented about the inside of that house comes from her side of it. Her testimony, her makeup man, her hairdresser, her lawyer, her friends. Every accusation carries her fingerprints, which makes it easy to dismiss as the emotional account of an unstable woman. And that is exactly how it has been dismissed for 6 decades. His side consists of one gesture, repeated silently 3 times a week, at an address where she could not answer. There is a coda, and it's the closest thing this story has to justice, and it's very small. She kept things: notebooks, letters, scraps of poems, hotel stationery covered in her own handwriting. When she died, the bulk of her personal property passed under her will to Lee Strasberg, and after his death to his widow, and it sat in filing cabinets and boxes for decades while the world argued about her. In 2010, a selection of those papers was published. Her handwriting, her spelling, her crossings out, unmediated by a studio or a husband or a biographer. That is the only substantial body of Marilyn Monroe's own words about her own life that no man she married ever controlled. It survives because she wrote things down, and somebody kept the box. Meanwhile, after DiMaggio died, his longtime attorney and confidant published a book claiming to reveal what he'd said about her at the end. DiMaggio's own family disputed that man's role and his reliability, and so did his most serious biographer. So even the silence didn't hold cleanly. The final word on the great romantic silence of the 20th century is contested testimony from a man with a financial interest in the estate. And his son Joe Jr., the boy from the marriage that ended when the actress quit, the one who called her the night before she died. He outlived his father by 5 months. He died in August 1999 at 57 in a trailer in Northern California. So go back to the $50. May 1949, a red velvet drape, a woman who needed the rent, a fee of $50 for a photograph that would be reproduced millions of times and earn a fortune for everybody except her. That's where this started. Her image, in circulation, out of her hands, making money for other people. And that's what she spent the rest of her life trying to take title to. She confirmed the calendar instead of denying it. She refused the script she wasn't allowed to read. She walked out on the studio and put her own name on a company. She got approval over her material. For a woman in that industry in that decade, she came astonishingly close to owning herself. And then she died, and a man who was not her husband claimed her body, chose the 30 people permitted to look at her, and placed a standing order that would speak on his behalf uncontradicted for 20 years. Look at the roses again. For 60 years, America has read those 3 deliveries a week as the most romantic gesture of the 20th century. A man so faithful he mourned a 9-month marriage for 4 decades. But follow what those flowers actually did. They arrived at an address where she could not respond. They kept a claim alive on a woman who had spent her entire adult life prying her own image loose from men who wanted to hold it. They filled a silence that a court transcript should have filled. They made him the widower he had never legally been. And week after week, for 20 years, they told the world that this had been a love story and that the finding of cruelty was a technicality. The word cruelty isn't mine. I didn't put it in the title as a hook. It was entered in a Los Angeles County courthouse on October 27, 1954, uncontested, by a judge who had heard both sides available to him. Marilyn Monroe got the immortality. Joe DiMaggio got the silence. And the silence, not the marriage, is the thing nobody has ever managed to open.